He heard voices outside. He whispered to Mum to come outside with him. She realized the voice was someone calling for help. They took the yard lamp down the lane to find Miss Fritz in a ditch next to the road. She had a broken leg. We children loved Miss Fritz, who was really Mrs. Molly Fitzpatrick. Mum loved her too because she had a way of turning life's pains into laughter. In different voices, she told stories of banshees and pookas and nasty leprechauns and badly behaved fairies. In Dad's struggle to exact a living from the land, there was little room for joy. Dad believed if God saw people being too happy, he would send heavy rains and high winds to put them in their place. If Dad barged into the kitchen when Miss Fritz was there, she'd get up and go home. Dad did not like Miss Fritz. But she was a neighbor, and Dad always helped the neighbors. She was old with brittle bones, so when she fell into a 3-foot ditch that drained animal muck from the barn, Dad and Mum became her savior. They brought a chair for her to sit on as they carried her dripping with mud and muck up the lane to our house. Even a broken leg couldn't silence her. Oh, I got so hoarse calling for help that I nearly gave up, and I began to think I was going to die at the bottom of the ditch, covered with that terrible black, stinky muck. And no one would know what had happened to me until your father cleaned out the drain next year and found me, preserved like the body of a saint. Oh, Saint Moll Fitzpatrick, with me picture on a holy card, with me eyes turned up to heaven, and me hands joined in prayer, and a golden halo about me head. I would be the patron saint of people who fall into mucky ditches, if there isn't one already. We children thought it was a wonderful story, but my father thought it terribly irreligious to imagine someone like Miss Fritz becoming a saint just for falling into a ditch of cow manure. One day, a Christian brother showed up in our classroom at the boys' school. He was there to recruit a few hardworking, clever boys for the Christian Brothers School in Dublin. By the time he had finished describing the glories of the school and the free education offered at St. Mary's College, I was sold. My priestly dreams had gone up in ashes. That evening, Brother Conliffe unexpectedly arrived at our house, sat on the kitchen table, and told my parents about the wonderful advantages their son would have at the school. The next morning after my chores, I was riding on the seat of the pony cart with Dad on our way to mend a fence. He stopped unexpectedly. We sat there for a moment. Then he began to talk about the time I bought a penknife at the fair in Dublin. This was very strange. My father never talked to me about anything except the farm. That lad selling penknives had stood on a box claiming their steel fell out of the sky 1,000,000 years ago, landed in Germany, and was so fine the blade never needed to be sharpened. Against my father's advice, I bought one. It fell apart a few weeks later. Tom, that Brother Conliffe is a bit like your man with the penknives. He goes around saying things about the school, but he didn't tell you everything, the way the Fair Day hucksters don't tell you everything. He didn't tell you that you'll get homesick being away from your brother and your sisters and your mother and your father and your friends at school. He didn't tell you that you'll have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. He didn't tell you you'll have to wash in cold water and then go for a run, whether it's sunny or rainy. He didn't tell you you'll have to eat lumpy porridge for breakfast, then sit in the classroom for 4 hours. He didn't tell you, Dad, will you talk to Brother Conliffe and tell him I don't want to be a Christian brother after all? Sure, I'll tell him. He squeezed my shoulder. Now let's mend that fence. My father had succeeded yet again in keeping me on my path to the priesthood. The weather exercised a tyranny over Dad's farming life, creating alternating periods of crisis and calm, and sometimes days of frantic intensity. He was often gaunt with fatigue. The bad weather in the autumn of 1947 brought the farmers of Ireland to their knees as they strove to save their crops. Men and women and children spent long, slogging days carrying cut grain out of flooded fields. Acres of potatoes rotted in the liquid clay. Mud and muck oozed into boots and crept up clothing to crotches and armpits. One Saturday afternoon, Dad sloshed into the kitchen for a hot mug of tea. Everything about him was wet. We knew as children that this was not a time to play or laugh out loud. When Dad told Eddie to put on his coat and cap and bring in a basket of peat, I volunteered to help so that I might escape the house. I quickly ran to the shed and decided to surprise my brother when he arrived. I jumped up onto a pile of stacked turf and began dancing a hornpipe. But it wasn't Eddie who came in. It was Dad. I still remember the beating he gave me, the whacking with hard hands. I can still recall the feeling of utter rejection, of being thrown out of the shed, out of Dad's life and into the heavy rain. I can still see myself in the farmyard in the rain, standing in terror, beaten for the infraction of having a bit of fun. A long time ago, I stopped crying for the small boy I was then, but I still weep for Dad, having to endure forever the remembrance of what he had done to me. I rue the fact that neither he nor I developed the communication skills that would have allowed us to talk about the incident, to hear each other's words of forgiveness. Now, I remember him as a man who loved his wife and children, who at times was driven over the edge while trying desperately to provide for them. Several years later, when I was 11, my father suggested I join the boys' boxing club founded by Father Flood. "It'll make a man out of you," my father said. No doubt my father was thinking about the numerous occasions I had come home from school in tears after bloody encounters with town boys. On the opening night of boxing club, Father Flood persuaded 2 big men to give a demonstration match. There was no referee. They walked into the circle of boys, smiled at each other, tapped their gloves together, and instantly began beating the living daylights out of each other. This wasn't sport. This was total war. This wouldn't be over until someone was dead. Each man sent murderous punches to each other's bodies, sometimes causing knees to buckle. Eventually, each man had blood dripping down his face. Suddenly, other big men rushed between the 2 gladiators before things got really serious and shuffled them out the door. I knew in my heart I did not want to be a boxer, but my father insisted. At the first practice, my biceps, which were like knots on white thread, struggled to hold up the heavy gloves. I was so poor at the practice moves that I was relegated to holding up my gloved hands to the smaller boxers so they could practice their punches. The first one hit so hard that my own glove banged into my face. My nose bled. Excitement soared in the club one night when Father Flood announced he had arranged a boxing match between Mount Millick and a team in Kilkenny. Everyone in the club attended to cheer on our best boxers. On the night of the big fight, my father insisted that I take along my boxing togs in a brown paper bag, just in case one of the other boys couldn't fight. I would be ready to take his place. I knew it was not a good idea. Sure enough, Paddy Connors wanted to see what I had in my bag. I tried to hide it behind me, but another boy grabbed it and threw my boxing clothes into the air. Soon, Paddy Connors was taunting me. "Look, Tommy Phelan thinks he's going to be the champion tonight, but he can't even fight his way out of a paper bag." The boys laughed and kicked my clothes away. Connors was the only one on the Mount Millick team to win his bout that night. I had silently hoped his Kilkenny opponent would kill him. The match lasted so late that we did not arrive back in Mount Millick until 2 a.m. My father was waiting to take me home on his bike. Riding on the handlebars, I tearfully told my father about the troubles that brown paper bag had caused. As we traveled along the canal line, Dad asked, "Would you like to give up boxing, Tom?" That night, Dad was St. George on a high bike, my savior. On a June day in 1965, I was one of 32 newly ordained priests proceeding down the aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral. My dad's plan for me had materialized. I was 24. 11 years later, living in New York City, I got a call from my brother Eddie back on the farm. Dad was dying, so I came home. When I entered St. Vincent's home, Dad held his arms feebly in the air as if reaching out to take a baby. "Tom," he cried. "Dad," I sobbed as we awkwardly clutched each other, my wet, bearded face next to his trembling, toothless mouth. The sun bending down, the father reaching up, each clutching at something that had slipped out from between them and grasping at it for a fleeting moment. I got down on my knees beside the bed and held the backs of my father's fingers against my forehead. My sobbing body made noises in the springs of the bed. I felt my father's free hand in my hair, touching, resting there. I heard his cries like the creaking of a old barn in the wind. "Dom," he said eventually, I was hoping you'd come home to rake the stubbles. You better use Whiteface, even though she'll drive you mad with that tail of hers, swiping at flies even when there's none to swipe. Now the wheel rakes over in the sandpit field near the gate. But be careful coming through the gate. You know, it's barely wide enough. And don't forget to grease the axle." Watching my father's face, I saw the old eyes looking at the past, watch them wander all over the farm, unable to separate the layers of time, seeing people and horses in the wrong years and seasons. The words flowed out of knots of time trapped in his memory, rising to the surface like random bubbles, floating up from the deep bottom of a bog hole. Later, Eddie and I visited Dad's favorite place on the farm near the beech trees. Eddie told me about Dad's last day on the farm before they took him to St. Vincent's. Dad had wandered away from the house, but they found him, sitting near the base of one of the trees, surrounded by cattle who seemed to have come over to say goodbye. I started to cry. Then with great sorrow, Eddie began to sob. Together in the hedges we wept, letting the sorrow come out loudly and unashamed. Side by side in the bushes, Eddie with his head on his arms, me looking blindly at the beech trees, the tears flowing itchingly into my beard.